So when we talk about sound to print learning, we talk about it sometimes in a big way. We want kids to know language through Hebrew through movement, infusing Hebrew words into English sentences, being able to be comfortable in tefillah, that they keep hearing the prayers over and over again. And the question is, how does all this help us when they get to the print on the page? I have been asked that question a lot. I've had directors who say to me, my cantor, for instance, is pleased that the children are like they're just booming out Gevurot during tefillah when they have it together, but is disappointed that the children are not meeting their expectations when they get to the point of saying, here, I'd like you to read Gevurot. And as we have been working more and more with the idea of sound to print learning, we've come up with strategies that help teachers take the sounds that are in kids' heads so they can match them to the print on the page. Now, there are those who say that it's cheating. You should not learn to chant first before you get to the point of decoding. And there are others who say, it's making a difference. And I want to introduce you to one of those teachers, Linda Duke, who not only is a master teacher for Hebrew through movement, but she teaches fourth and fifth grade in a synagogue setting. And she has been experimenting with things, and they offer help to all of us in figuring out this conundrum of, does sound to print learning really work? So Linda, thanks for being here and talking to us.
I'm glad to be here this morning, Nachama.
Excellent. So I know that recently you had a hypothesis about what was going on with decoding. Can you tell me what was going through your mind?
Yes, I had noticed in a lot of the activities we do in the classroom, especially during one game we played, that students definitely decoded much more easily and fluently when they knew the words. They had heard them in prayers, they had heard the phrases in prayers, rather than something that they had never seen before. And my hypothesis was that starting with the sound and going to the print, hearing the prayers, getting familiar with the words and so on, made it much easier when they had the print in front of them to then take what was written there and vocalize it accurately and more easily.
So when you were thinking about that, what were you seeing among the students?
I see a lot of things that they were very comfortable decoding lines that they knew from prayers. They struggled a lot more with lines they had never seen before, that there was a word from a prayer that they knew, like mishpachot, and they saw it somewhere else, they could get it pretty quickly. Whereas if it was a word they had never heard before or hadn't heard with enough experience for them to really have it in their minds, that they struggled more. They did more of the what you would normally see with a beginning or intermediate decoder, where they would do one letter and vowel at a time and slowly get through the word. It looks like a couple things. One is that we will chant a line and have the students chant back, or I will chant the line, or the Madri, he will, and the students chant it back to us. And we do that, adding on more and more words as we go, but they're really not decoding or using the paper at that point, the printed words at that point. They're doing it more from sound, hearing the words and repeating them. Sometimes we play a game called Sparkle, where we take a certain phrase from a prayer and each student says one word of it, and the person who says the last word sits down, and we keep repeating it until only one person's standing. So again, the idea is they're hearing the words over and over again, and they're starting to get planted in their minds.
And you're not using transliteration.
They're not using any transliteration at
Okay.
all. No.
Okay. Keep
Most
going.
of the activities, they aren't using the print at all either. Most of them prefer just listening to the words and saying them at this point. They like the print later on, but not when they're first getting to the point where they know the prayer. So that's pretty much what we did for the teaching of the prayer part of it. And then you get longer and longer portions of the prayer until eventually they can hopefully chant the entire prayer.
Okay. And okay, so then now talk about what your experiment was.
So my experiment was to take a sheet where I had 6 lines of text. The first 4 were from prayers they had learned in that manner earlier in the year. Some of them they also would sing on Sundays for review, some they didn't. It depended a little bit on what Sunday class they were in. And some of the students knew some of the prayers better than others just because of absences, where they were decoding it earlier in the year, and lots of other varieties among students. But the first line especially, which is the beginning of the Eleno, is one they all knew really well because we've been working on it most recently, and they were all part of working on that prayer together. And the last two lines were lines from prayers that they had never heard before. Or if they had, it'd be something they heard maybe when they were in a service, but nothing that they would have focused on the words. And what I found with every single one of them was they did much better for the first few lines than they did with the last couple. No matter what their decoding level was, there was still a very consistent pattern there, where students definitely did much better with prayers they recognized.
So Linda, can you give us some specific examples from what you saw within their work?
Sure. So, for example, there was one student who I had the sheet in front of her, and I was just getting ready for her to start reading to me. And she immediately looked and said, "Oh,
this is Lelino."
And proceeded to be able to sing the first line perfectly because she knew it was from Elena and knew what it was. She then went on to the second line, assuming the Elena continued, and
Take
real carefully the next line.
Asher.
What's this vowel?
O. Se.
Good. Osa.
Shalom. Bimromav.
Good.
Linda, before I ask you to talk about what you found, I want to make sure that people know that there are 3 different words that we use, usually 3 different ways. One is reading, which is when you look at print and you immediately know what it means, you have context, and you read for meaning. There is decoding, which is the blending together of letters and vowels. Sometimes decoding can be slow and laborious. Sometimes it can be a little faster, and there could be meaning. A child or anybody could decode shalom and then suddenly go, oh, shalom, I know what that is. But they went through the shalom to get to that place. And then the third term is reciting or chanting. Reciting is when it just flows. You can learn to recite a poem. You learn to recite blessings. We recite, I suppose, in some ways, songs. And it can be deliberately taught to someone. You're going to repeat it over and over again until it gets in memory. Or if they just experience it long enough, it gets into memory and they can recite. Okay, so Linda, as you were listening to these children, what did you find? What did you hear?
For several of the students, they actually began to recite some of the earlier lines that they knew well. They weren't decoding at that point. They were using the papers to help them remember what the recitation would include, but they were definitely doing more reciting of the blessings.
Elenu Lishabeh La Adon Hako.
Go ahead.
Say Shalom Bimromav.
And if you listen to the beginning where they recite the blessings, and then later on when they are decoding because it's something that's not familiar to them, there is a huge difference in terms of the ease with which they're getting the sounds that they see on the paper to come out as words or as letters and vowels that they're piecing together.
Kamish Pahot.
Good.
Ha'adama.
Good. Keep going. You're doing a great job.
Ashir. Ashir.
Yeah.
Havo.
So this whole thing is a vowel. Oh, so what would the word be?
Ho.
Ho.
A.
Hotse.
Hotse. T.
Good. It was interesting that several of the students began to chant the first few lines because that's how they now know those lines. They know how to chant the Eleno. And it wasn't even the decoding or even reading. It was really the chanting that came through in the videos.
Elenu Lishabeh La Adon Hako.
Good. Try the second one.
Say Shalom Bimromav.
So somebody might ask, well, isn't that cheating? They're not really decoding that we want kids to decode. What do you say to that?
My mind, it isn't, but it depends, I guess, on what the goal of your program is. If the goal is to let students be able to come to a service and participate comfortably and be an active part of the service, then I think that whatever way you teach them to do that is a win. And, decoding, I think, is a good skill to some extent, but it depends on what your end goal is. Do you want them to be able to pick up something and decode it that has no meaning or context for them, or do you want them to be able to participate in a prayer service? The other thing I noticed was that individual words sometimes came through differently because they knew them. One student, for example, was decoding. He got him past the lines that he knew well. And he's actually one of my top decoders. He does it quite well compared to a lot of the other students. But when he was reading the line that included the word Mitzrayim, you could hear a real difference when he got to the last word.
Etchem. Me'eret.
Yep, Me'eretz, good. And the last word?
Mitzrayim.
And as he tells us, that word was much easier for him because he knew that word from other prayers. Was there some reason that one was easier, or did it just happen to come out?
It sounded the same as a lot it's the same word in a lot of different prayers too.
So you knew that word even if you didn't know the whole line of the prayer? Super, thank you. So it wasn't even just that whole line was stuck in his mind as a song or a blessing or a phrase that went together. The individual word also came out much more easily.
I love that example also because it's we don't think about how kids make connections with what they're doing. And sometimes I think, and it's probably a lot of the time, it's just a blob of language to them, but that this child identified this is a word that he's heard in other places was pretty eye-opening to me.
Yes, I heard that to some extent with other words too, the word kishkes. Definitely not an easy word for beginning decoders to decode. So
Kishkes.
Yeah.
Adama.
But a lot of them went through it very easily. And even if they missed the beginning of the word, once they got on track, they could kind of fill in the end of it because they knew the word from other contexts.
Kamishpahot.
They knew it from the prayer. Students in my homeroom on Sunday we talked about the word mishpacha in a different context, and having them be familiar with the word again made it much easier for them to vocalize it when they saw it on paper.
But what about the kids that started saying Goye?
Velo. Samanu. Kigoye.
Yep, a lot of them did that because that's what came next in their mind. And for most of them, if I then got them started on the word kamishpachot, they then were able to immediately finish it off. They realized they were in the wrong place of the prayer compared to what was on the paper, and they could easily correct it. Try again. Lo samanu.
Kamishpahot.
So another thing I thought was interesting is I have one student who is definitely more at the beginning to kind of just beyond beginning decoding level. And she also was able to zoom through a couple of those lines because she knew them so well from the prayers. Another student I have says she struggles with hearing some of the words, and sometimes she does. But even with that particular student, there's a clear difference between the lines she knew and the lines she didn't know. And when I asked her about it at the end of the video, about were there some lines that were easier and why, she said, these, because I already know them. I know them all from the prayers. So even the students were very aware. Every single student I did this with was very aware of the fact that it was much easier when they knew the lines already from the prayers than just picking up something to decode for the first time.
The things that I was thinking about also was when kids are struggling, or even an adult is struggling with decoding, what that must do to their soul, so to speak. We talk about social emotional learning. We talk about confidence and competence. Based upon what you saw, can you talk to that a bit? Because there were kids who did the 4 lines great, and then they got to this point of what we often see in a Hebrew classroom.
Perfect. Okay, and one more.
U. E. Na.
Uvin.
Uvin. Va.
Look at the vowel.
V.
Good.
Yeah.
Uvin.
A.
Good. Yeah, I think the students definitely feel great when they can recite the prayers and join in. they feel good. They've accomplished something. They can be part of the group. They can go to a service and participate. And you see smiles on their faces when they're able to do that. They're excited about being able to do it. Decoding is often frustrating for some of the students. And while I think there is value in teaching the decoding, it's got to be done in a way where they don't have that discouraged feeling that you just mentioned, Nachama, because I think it's really easy with the skill that you're having trouble with to get discouraged. And one advantage, I think, of doing the sound first and also the decoding is it makes the decoding a little less frustrating because they know the sounds, even if they don't know them as well as some of these students who can do it without even looking at the paper. But then if you have a word that they're mispronouncing and you want to call attention to them, you're calling attention to one word, like the child who didn't have the final nun and a don. If you point out one letter like that, it's not discouraging to them. And hopefully then they'll start recognizing the final nun and can use it in decoding. If you have the whole line, like some of them were decoding, where they didn't know any of it, that can get very frustrating because it's so slow and tedious for them.
Yeah, and I've seen other examples of slow and tedious or slow and laborious or whatever. There's also a story that one of our colleagues told me about an adult who was decoding some prayers, someone who was working towards her bat mitzvah, and it was definitely this slow and laborious like thing. And the director looked at her and finally said, I know you know this prayer because you come to services all the time. And the adult said, well, I thought it would be cheating if I used what I knew from reciting and that this is what I needed to do. I needed to be able to do this. And the answer is no, you do not need to struggle through this. You can use what's in your head to match the print on the page, which is what happens also when we read English, that the words through this process are burned in our brains and we just look at the word and we know what it is, which doesn't happen with Hebrew because we don't have the language skill. But that this instant recognition of something helps. And even listening to some kids who will pause a moment and then give the word, they're putting it together in their head. They're matching it. They know what it should sound like your example of kamishpachot. They know what it should sound like rather than needing to go laboriously, segment by segment by segment. So I guess one of the questions for you is you have a soapbox. Like, what would you be telling other teachers at this point from summarize what you've learned and what you feel people should be doing as we move forward?
What I've learned is that sound to print definitely makes a huge difference, both in the student's confidence and in the ability to learn the prayers. I could spend weeks and weeks and weeks having them decode a prayer over and over again, and eventually maybe they'll get it and maybe they'll just get discouraged. But this works. I think the decoding is an important piece just in terms of having the students be able to recognize the Hebrew letters and vowels. Most of them like being able to read it because Hebrew is a language that's dear to their hearts. But I don't think that needs to be the ending goal to make them absolutely fluent, because I think the reality is that none of them are ever going to be able to decode fast enough in a service to keep up with an unknown prayer. And I think that's true of myself and most adults. Even if we read Hebrew really well, if it's something that's totally brand new that we've never heard before, it would probably be a little bit slower than synagogue pacing during a service. So I think the more the students hear whatever prayer you're working on, whether it's read or chanted, whatever your goal is, many, many times, and then start associating it with the words on the page, it's a really effective and less frustrating way of students to learn and be able to join in the prayer service.
There's a difference, I think, in what you're offering the students, in that generally it's the prayers in order. And I know you're also using the large font, extra white space, and that they're spaced according to the phrasing. And one of the accepted practices today, when people say, well, I really want them to decode fluently and accurately in anything I give them, is that it's a mishmash of words. It's 6 lines down, 4 words across, and you just expect them to decode anything out of order, but that's not where you're heading to. Is that correct?
That's correct. This year, as a matter of fact, we changed all the tefillah binders that the students use on Sundays, as well as the material I use with them during the week. So when they're practicing prayers at home or during class, the prayer is set up larger font than the Siddur. bigger spacing, double spacing between words, which I think the new Siddur might as well. The new Reformed Siddur might also.
Yeah, I don't know that all the things are phrased, but there's more white space between words, not necessarily between lines.
Right. And we also use the David font now, which is the same as the Siddur. So that what the students are seeing in front of them is laid out exactly like the Siddur they would use at a service, except that it's much bigger font.
Mm-hmm.
And last year I had a number of students who, when they started partway through a prayer, I started partway through a prayer and said, "Where am I?" They could find the place very easily because they knew the setup of the page. So again, if your goal is to have students be able to participate in the service at your temple and at, lots of other temples too, whether you're part of the Reformed group or the conservative or whichever group you're focusing on, if the prayers are set up exactly the same way as the Siddur, I think it makes it much easier for students to follow along at a service.
And it was actually your work on that question, that thing of like, where am I in the prayer, that got me started on this in a different way, because we used pieces of that for professional development for others. And somebody, I posted something on Facebook with the webinar, and then somebody said, "Oh my gosh, I want my kids to master decoding as well as these kids." And I went back and watched the videos, and they were not decoding. And the video that sticks in my mind is the girl who says,
"When the teacher said El Elyon, I knew that El Elyon was in the middle. It's right here. So I looked in the middle of the page to try and find it. And my eyes caught on to the words."
because the El Elyon is in her head, and then she is pointing exactly to that point on the page, which is why somebody thought that she was decoding well. But she definitely had the sounds, but she knew right where it was on the page. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
And that's what we saw in these videos too, I think, Nachama, because if anybody who saw these students read the beginning lines, they say, wow, they have amazing decoding skills. And in fact, they weren't decoding those lines. The ones who did that fluently had it in their heads.
Right. And matched it to the page. So then what happens when, let's take the person who did not, for instance, pronounce some words correctly, even in the word things they knew. One of the arguments against having people learn to chant before they decode, whether it's with prayers or whether it's with the Torah verses, is that they're going to memorize things by making mistakes. And then we have to fix them. So how easy are they to fix? And are you concerned about what's called fossilized errors when it's stuck?
Right. I looked at that a little bit last year with the think tanks, Nahama. And what I found was if the student knew most of the words, so they had most of them in their minds correctly and had a few errors here and there of words that they were mispronouncing, having them focus just on those words pretty rapidly cleared up the miscues or the errors. I tried circling them in the prayer and said, just read this word, 3 times and really think about that word. And I'll go back and do a little longer segment, including that word. And it did not take too long for them to get those errors corrected. I had one girl this year who, when we did the reading, said ada with a daled rather than a ta in one of the prayers. I didn't correct it during this video because she was on a roll and I wanted to let her keep going. But what I would do is in the classroom next time, point out that word to her. And in fact, if she had it wrong in her mind, which I'm guessing she probably does, point out that it's a tav, have her say it a few times. And I would hypothesize that within a week, she's going to have that word done correctly.
Yeah, and I know that one can also, like, let's say if they were messing up kamish bachot, which is one of those words you could mess up, that covering up the word and offering it a few times orally, we're back to, can they hear the sounds of what's in the word so that they hear it, and then match it back to the print on the page. That also is a strategy that can work at clearing that up. And this thing that I also say when people ask me that is, if you think about the number of English songs, the language, but the number of English songs that suddenly we go, oh wait, that's what that word is, or that's what that phrase is. We don't always hear it correctly, but we know that we can correct it easily enough.
And that's one thing I think is really important when you're teaching these kids is to make sure you hear some of them do it individually, not just as group singing, because it's really easy when they're singing as a group. And I like doing that as well. It's a good experience and a good lesson for lots of different reasons. But is there are students who'll be mispronouncing words or kind of mouthing words that aren't quite right, and it looks like they're joining in. So I find if I work with them individually, there are some students who just aren't auditory learners. They find it harder to learn that way. And yes, they're hearing a lot of it and getting in a lot of it just by the repetition of hearing it, as all the other students are, but they do need a little more individual work to get some of the words right if they aren't hearing them correctly.
So thanks, Linda. What I appreciate is that you kind of reflect on what's going on in your classroom. I know that your experience, you've done this a long time, but I think many times when we teach, it's like, I need to teach this, and we just bowl over with whatever it is that we think we need to be doing without being reflective. I'm always appreciating the questions that you go, oh, I think I'm going to try this out and see where we get. So thank you very much for continuing with the questions you have and searching for answers, which help us all.
You're very welcome, Nachama.
A pleasure.
Okay, go ahead.
Aleinu l'shabeh la'adon hakol.
And the next, yep, go ahead.
Say shalom b'mamav
Good, try the next one.
ki ata hu melech adon.
And how about the next one?
Velo samanu ke goye.
Try that again. Take another look at the letters.
Kamishpahot ha'adama
Super, keep going.
asher ha'ots
Hotsati.
Hotsati ahem
That's Ham, yep.
ahem me eret
Good.
meets Raim
Perfect, and one more line.
uvi na va a
VA, yep.
ha
Look at the vowel.
ha met
Yep.
va edek.
Vatzedek. Super. Did you find any lines easier to read than others?
These 4
And what made it easier, do you think?
because I knew them already.
Because you're from the prayer. Okay, perfect.